The road had been long. Behind Duncan lay the grave of the only knight he had ever truly known. Ahead lay Ashford Meadow, and perhaps the first real opportunity of his life. Duncan rode beneath the open sky with 3 horses following behind him. They were almost everything he possessed. Ser Arlen's armor, Ser Arlen's sword, Ser Arlen's shield, and the 3 horses that had belonged to the old hedge knight. Duncan had buried his master, but he had not buried his master's dream. For years, Sir Arlen had wandered the 7 kingdoms, looking for service, glory, and a chance to prove himself. Now the old knight was gone, and Duncan had decided that he would try to achieve what his master never had. He would enter the tournament at Ashford. Perhaps he could win. Perhaps a lord would notice him. Perhaps, for the first time, people would remember the name Ser Duncan the Tall. But there was one problem. Duncan had almost no money, and tournaments were expensive. When Duncan reached Ashford, the sight before him was almost overwhelming. The meadow had become a temporary city. Thousands of people had gathered. Knights' pavilions stood beneath fluttering banners. Horses filled the camps. Merchants sold weapons, food, clothing, and armor. Squires rushed about carrying messages and equipment. And every Duncan looked, there were knights. Knights from wealthy houses. Knights whose armor shone like polished silver. Knights who had trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. Duncan looked down at his own battered equipment. He suddenly felt very small. Not in body. Never in body. But in importance. He was simply a hedge knight. And nobody at Ashford seemed to know his name. His first task was to find the man responsible for registering the competitors. But there was a problem. The tournament officials wanted proof that Duncan was actually a knight. Duncan told them that Sir Arlen had knighted him before dying. But who could prove it? Sir Arlen was dead, and there had been no witnesses. Without someone willing to vouch for him, Duncan might not even be allowed onto the field. His great tournament dream could end before he ever raised a lance. So Duncan went looking for someone who had known his master. That search eventually brought him into contact with Sir Manfred Dondarion. Duncan hoped the knight would remember Sir Arlen. Instead, he discovered how quickly the past could disappear. Manfred barely remembered the old hedge knight. For Duncan, it was a painful realization. His master had spent his entire life serving others. And now that he was dead, almost nobody remembered him. Duncan began wondering whether that would be his fate too. To wander, to fight, to grow old, and then disappear without leaving anything behind. But then Duncan's fortune changed. Inside Ashford Castle, he encountered members of the royal family. The Targaryens had arrived, and among them was Prince Baelor Breakspear, heir to the Iron Throne. Duncan had little reason to expect help from a prince. Yet Baelor remembered Ser Arlen. He remembered fighting the old knight years before, and unlike the others, Baelor did not dismiss Duncan. He listened. He asked questions. And eventually, Baelor accepted Duncan's word. The hedge knight would be allowed to compete. For Duncan, the moment meant more than permission to enter a tournament. A prince had remembered his master. For one brief moment, Sir Arlen was no longer forgotten. But Baelor also gave Duncan an important warning. Duncan could not simply continue using his master's coat of arms. If he was truly a knight, he needed a device of his own. So Duncan began thinking about what his shield should represent. and that led him back to the performers he had seen around the tournament. Among them was a young puppeteer named Tansel. Duncan was immediately taken by her. She was different from the noble women he had seen around the camps. She lived on the road. She worked with her hands, and she had a confidence that caught Duncan completely off guard. He asked her to paint his new shield, and eventually they settled on an image, an elm tree beneath a shooting star. It was not the sigil of a great house. It did not represent generations of conquest. It belonged to Duncan alone. For the first time, he had a symbol of his own. Meanwhile, Egg was proving that he was far more than an ordinary boy. He knew the names of knights. He recognized their heraldry. He knew which men were dangerous. Duncan couldn't understand how a stable boy could possibly know so much. But Egg never seemed bothered by the questions. He simply watched, listened, and remembered. Duncan had no idea how important that habit would become. Then the tournament began, the field filled with spectators. Trumpets sounded, horses thundered across the lists. Lances shattered against shields. Knights were thrown from their saddles. Every successful charge brought cheers from the crowd. For the wealthy, it was spectacle. For Duncan, it was a chance to change his life. He studied the competitors carefully. Some were too experienced. Some were too powerful. Some carried names that could make a common knight nervous simply by hearing them. And among the competitors were members of the Targaryen family, including Prince Valar, the son of Baelor Breakspear. And then there was another Targaryen, one whose presence made Duncan increasingly uncomfortable. Aerion Brightflame. Aerion was handsome, young, royal, and arrogant. Very arrogant. Duncan watched him carefully. There was something about the prince that didn't feel right. Then Aerion entered the lists against Sir Humphrey Harding. The crowd watched eagerly. Harding was an experienced knight. He had already defeated numerous opponents, but Aerion approached the contest differently. His actions were brutal. His lance struck Harding's horse. The animal collapsed. Harding went down with it and suffered a terrible injury. The crowd fell strangely quiet. This was supposed to be the sport of knights, a contest of courage and skill. But what Duncan had just witnessed looked more like cruelty. Duncan couldn't understand how a prince could behave that way. Egg, however, seemed to understand immediately. The boy watched Aerion with a seriousness that Duncan had rarely seen from him, and he insisted that the prince had done it deliberately. Duncan wasn't convinced. He still wanted to believe that knights, even arrogant ones, had rules they respected. But something had changed. The tournament no longer looked quite so glorious. That evening, Duncan sat among the tents and fires of Ashford Meadow. Around him, knights celebrated. Musicians played. Servants carried food and wine. The banners of great houses moved in the evening wind. But Duncan's thoughts kept returning to Aerion and to Tansel. He didn't know it yet, but those two things were about to collide. And when they did, Duncan's tournament would cease to be about winning gold. It would become a question of honor, a question that would put a hedge knight directly against a prince of the blood. And that decision would change Duncan's life forever.